As expected, the Seahawks won't be picking up Jordyn Brooks' fifth-year option on his rookie contract. What does that mean for the veteran linebacker and the team moving forward? Rob Rang and I are going to be breaking it all down in our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Aloha 12s. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined for our Wednesday episode recording here from Hawaii by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks, as always, to all the 12s out there for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We're going to continue our post-draft coverage today, looking at Jaxon Smith-Njigba, where the former Ohio State receiver fits into Seattle's offense heading into the 2023 season and beyond. We'll also take a look at Jordyn Brooks' contract situation and Seattle's reported undrafted free agent signings on defense. There are actually some pretty intriguing names they've added on defense in the undrafted ranks that Rob and I are looking forward to breaking down. We'll get to that later on the show. Now for your lead story here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. The Seahawks had a couple of days after the draft to finalize whether or not they were going to give Jordyn Brooks the fifth-year option. And sticking with status quo, John Schneider has still never given one of his own first-round draft picks a fifth-year option. They declined it on Brooks. And really, Rob, this isn't a surprise at this stage because Brooks is coming off a torn ACL. There's a chance he could miss the beginning of the 2023 season. But as Pete Carroll talked about today on multiple radio interviews, that does not mean the Seahawks do not have Brooks as part of their future. In fact, it sounds like they may be still working on trying to hash out a contract extension now to ensure that he doesn't make it to the free agent market next March.
Yeah, that's the thing, is I think that Seattle just views Jordyn Brooks and all of those guaranteed dollars that he would receive if Seattle was to accept that fifth-year option, that's just too rich for a player who's coming off the ACL, a player who, as productive as he was a year ago, Corbin, he finished with 3 tackles for loss. So that's just not the kind of production, the kind of big play ability that you're looking for a contract worth, north of $12 million. I mean, so I do think that it was predictable that Seattle would choose not to guarantee that fifth year. But at the same time, it also makes an awful lot of sense, as you just referred to, Pete Carroll basically already saying, look, Jordyn Brooks absolutely can be part of Seattle's long-term future as well as this upcoming season. And so I would not be surprised at all if Seattle tries to kind of go down that path, because Jordyn Brooks has been a durable, productive player. He just maybe isn't worth that type of the big type of financial commitment that his rookie contract would have guaranteed.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting here, if the Seahawks would have picked this up, again, it would have been the first time John Schneider has ever picked up the fifth-year option on a first-round pick that he made. They did the fifth-year option on Noah Fant last year, but he was drafted by the Denver Broncos, and that was a little under $7 million for a fully guaranteed contract. This would have been north of $10 million for Jordyn Brooks. And so that's a significant gap in money for a player that's coming off a significant knee injury. And so John Schneider decided, you know what, I want to make my own contract here with Jordyn Brooks. Let's see if we can get an extension that's got a lower cap hit in 2024, a long-term deal. That's what is likely being worked on behind the scenes, or at least they're kicking around the idea, how can we get him extended? Because I do think that the Seahawks view him as one of their foundational pieces still. Just because he got injured late last year, he's still a pretty young linebacker. He's consistently made a ton of tackles. As you mentioned, the impact plays haven't necessarily been there. The interceptions, he did have 10 tackles for loss 2 years ago. So he's shown he's capable. Last year, though, it just didn't come together the same way before that injury late in the season. So they'll be counting on him to get healthy and return to being disruptive in the run game, see some more improvements from him in coverage. I just look at this situation, and with Bobby Wagner re-signed, Devin Bush coming back, they're not going to have to force the issue rushing him back onto the field. And I think most teams would have made this decision with a player coming off of a knee injury this significant, that we just don't want to be on the hook for that much money. Not that we don't think he could be worth it, but we just don't think it's a smart decision now with him coming off this injury. He comes back healthy. They will have the chance to then pay him the money that he has earned with hopes that he's part of this team for the long haul.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if Jordyn Brooks comes back and balls out, then he might earn a paycheck that's worth more than what Seattle would have signed. So to me, this is, this is the best move for the Seahawks. This, I think, honestly, is the best move for Jordyn Brooks if he is able to come back healthy and have the type of season that I think that he can have. So I do think that this was, again, a fairly predictable move, and one that Seattle, prepared itself for by bringing Bobby Wagner back, by bringing in a player like Devin Bush, who has that same type of elite speed that Jordyn Brooks possesses, but also has, I do wonder how much of it is just the schematic change that Seattle underwent a year ago. If maybe that was part of the reason why Jordyn Brooks' big tackle for loss numbers from a season ago, you mentioned 10, dropped all the way down to 3 this past year. And so I think that it maybe plays a part of this as well. So that's something else to kind of keep in mind. But most importantly, as you talked about, it's just the injury, and the fact that the injury occurred when it did. Had this injury occurred in August or September, you would feel a lot better about where Jordyn Brooks was in his recovery. And we're hearing all kinds of positive things. Pete Carroll has talked about on numerous occasions that Jordyn Brooks is way, way ahead of schedule. Of course he is, because he is as motivated as anybody is. He's a dynamic athlete. That part has been proven. He also is, again, as motivated as anybody is going to become, because he wants to prove that he is healthy. He wants to be able to get that kind of generational wealth kind of contract that you can get in your second turn in the NFL. So again, I think that this was a predictable move by the Seahawks. I think that it's one that's going to wind up paying off big dividends for both the player and the club.
Yeah, and I think the big thing that we have to point out here is that Jordyn Brooks, based on production the last couple of years, I wouldn't have batted an eye if the Seahawks would have picked this up because of the numbers that he's put up and the fact that he is a younger player. But the timing of the injury, as you pointed out, that is really the biggest issue here. Because if you would have had a few more months here of recovery and you really felt good about him being ready for the start of 2023, regardless of what Pete Carroll says about him being ahead of schedule, it would still be pretty remarkable if he is able to suit up in week 1 in September, because that injury happened almost at the new year, and then he didn't have surgery for several weeks after. So he's still 3.5 months removed from that operation. And I would anticipate right now that he is just on the fringe of being available at the start of the season. We'll have to wait and see what happens. But the Seahawks were guarding against the possibility that he missed a good chunk of this next season. They didn't want to be on the hook for that kind of money the following year. But at the same time, it could work against them if he has a monster year coming off that injury and they're not able to work out an extension. If he hits the market, they might not be able to afford to re-sign him. So there's always a little bit of risk reward when you make these decisions. But more times than not, when the Seahawks have declined these fifth-year options, players have not earned that money. I don't think that's the case here with Jordyn Brooks, but with the injury, they still made the decision to decline that 5th year. So we'll see what ends up happening. It does sound like Pete Carroll and company are very interested in getting a deal done with him, and maybe they'll have an extension knocked out with him before training camp, especially if he continues to make great progress coming back from this injury. But for now, he is scheduled to be a free agent next March with this decision made before the May 2nd deadline. Coming up next here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks, the Seahawks had 2 first-round picks yesterday. We discussed their top 5 selection, Devin Witherspoon. We're going to go to the offensive side of the football with dynamic slot receiver Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who the Seahawks picked at number 20 overall. What does he bring to Seattle's offense in 2023 and beyond? We'll be discussing coming up next here on Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are now officially in the conference semifinals, which means it's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. New customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to points scored and three-pointers drained. I'm a huge fan of player prop parlays. You can make bets such as Jamal Murray of the Nuggets scoring 20 points at minus 270. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith, hosting here from Hawaii. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Let's get to Seattle's other first-round pick, shall we? We talked about Devin Witherspoon yesterday, the dynamic corner from Illinois, and now it's time to look at number 20, Jaxon Smith-Njigba, a player, Rob, that you mocked to the Seahawks a lot in the pre-draft process, viewed him as a really good fit to contrast DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, and they ended up pulling the trigger there on the player they view as the number one receiver in this class. What do you see Smith-Njigba bringing to this Seahawks offense that maybe they haven't had for the last couple of years to pair with those two dynamic stars in Metcalf and Lockett?
Well, I think that he's going to bring a pretty dynamic element as that number 3 receiver. And I say number 3 receiver, Corbin, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Jaxon Smith-Njigba puts up the type of numbers that are going to really push DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he winds up competing for Offensive Rookie of the Year honors. And that is both a reflection of the fact that I think that Jaxon Smith-Njigba, despite the fact that he only really started at Ohio State for one season, I still think that he is one of the most pro-ready receivers in this draft class. He's 6'1", he's 200 pounds. He reminds me a little bit of Keenan Allen, who I watched play at Cal. Nick Saban, back at Alabama, actually recruited Keenan Allen to play safety. And a big part of that, Corbin, is just because of the physicality, the mentality in which that Keenan Allen played. That's the same type of physicality and mentality that I see Jaxon Smith-Njigba play with. He just kind of bounces off of contact. He has very good hands. He has very quick feet, as he demonstrated with an unbelievable performance at the Combine, really showing off his change of direction in the 3-cone drill and the short shuttle, the fastest times recorded by any players in either drill at any position this year. So, I was one of the many, frankly, that was a little bit skeptical of Jaxon Smith-Njigba after he basically missed this entire season. I actually ranked him 6th among all the wide receivers when I wrote an article for Fox Sports way back in February prior to the Combine. And I think that justifiably I've taken a little bit of heat from some Seahawks fans who are saying, how can you be so high on Jaxon Smith-Njigba's fit now when you were so low on him before? Well, again, I had questions about his competitiveness because of the fact that a hamstring injury kept him out all season long. And I would have loved to have had an opportunity to interview Jaxon Smith-Njigba about the fact that he missed that time. But clearly, by the fact that the Seahawks selected him number 20 overall, the Seahawks feel very good about his competitiveness. And there's no question about it. The Ohio State wide receivers have had a great deal of success in the NFL. And Jaxon Smith-Njigba, when the lights were shining bright, it was absolutely unbelievable. And again, think about what he's going to be facing in Seattle. He's going to have DK Metcalf on one side. He's going to have Tyler Lockett on the other side. He's going to have Geno Smith, one of, statistically, the most accurate quarterback in the NFL a year ago, throwing the ball to him. I mean, it just sets up so nicely for Smith-Njigba to come into the NFL and be able to have a very soft landing and be very successful. Again, I think this is going to wind up being a home run pick for the Seahawks, and one that Seahawks fans are going to be praising for an awful long time to come.
As you pointed out, Ohio State receivers, not that all of them that are drafted high end up having outstanding star careers in the NFL, but it seems like the majority of them in the last 5 to 10 years that have come from that program have been worth the first round selection, ended up being studs in the NFL. The Seahawks are hoping that's the case with Smith-Njigba. And a lot of times with these players, particularly receivers, testing numbers don't always translate to what you see on the field. There's plenty of examples of top-notch receivers that have come out of the draft the last couple of years where you watch the film and you're like, I don't see a guy that ran a 6.7 3-cone, or I don't see 4.3 speed on film. But you see those elite change of direction skills on film with Jaxon Smith-Njigba, and it's not just coming out of his breaks. It's after the football is in his hands. This guy has elite acceleration once the football's in his hand. So he doesn't just break through arm tackles. He looks like he has rocket boosters once the ball's in his hand, even though he's not a 4.3 guy, ran in the low 4.5, which is respectable speed. With the change of direction, the acceleration he has, he is able to eat up big chunks of ground quickly. And that's why he was second in the entire nation in 2021 for yards after the catch. So this is a guy that, with all those coverages that teams are going to be playing, trying to neutralize DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett on the outside, there should be a lot of open grass, open turf, whatever surface they're playing on. There should be a lot of room for Jaxon Smith-Njigba to do what he does as an incredibly polished route runner, get open, and then once the football is in his hands, do a bunch of damage. If everything comes in line, and we know that it's not always the case with guys when they come out of the draft, you still have to go out and play on the field. But if he can do what he did when he was healthy 2 years ago, with the quarterback they've gotten, Geno Smith, how accurate he is, the two receivers on the outside, he should be a dynamic weapon from the slot right away. And just think about how much it's going to open things up for those other two guys. Teams eventually are going to have to adjust to, oh my gosh, this guy's killing us in the middle of the field with these intermediate routes. He's moving the chains. At some point, then you got to make your adjustments. And, oh, there's DK Metcalf, or there's Tyler Lockett, 40 yards downfield, wide open. And that's what the Seahawks have been consistently missing, that third guy that can truly strike fear in defenses. Jaxon Smith-Njigba is that kind of a talent when healthy.
Yeah, he absolutely is. And that's one of the things that I'm most excited about him. As you mentioned, the acceleration. Again, I'm going to kind of go back to the balance through contact. When defenders try to tackle him, I mean, this is a big man. He's got a lot of strength in his lower body. He's almost built like a running back with his, just big, thick thighs. And he's able to kind of break through tackles. He has some snaps where you see him beat people with quickness. You have some snaps where you see him beat people with that acceleration, that strength, and of course, again, the hands and the route running, his ability to get open. CJ Stroud has been mentioned by many people. CJ Stroud calls him the best route runner that he's ever had for him, and that's saying quite a lot when you consider that Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, of course, were the first round selections that they were a year ago, in the NFL. So again, I just think that we are talking about a player who's going to be able to come into the NFL and be very successful, and is going to absolutely justify Seattle's selection of him at number 20 overall.
Looking at the depth chart where things stand for the Seahawks right now, there's not any question as far as your top two receivers, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, still going to be dynamic in the X and Z spots. And both of them can play in the slot too when asked. And I think that's the big key with Jaxon Smith-Njigba. There are receivers that come into the NFL that have similar skill sets that don't really have the ability to line up on the outside, or that's not a strength for them. But I feel like at his size, and the fact is he can win downfield, that's not the biggest strength in his game, but he's got really good tracking skills, and he's got enough speed that he can catch you off guard. He can win downfield, and the Seahawks should be able to mix and match all three of these guys at all three spots across the formation. But I would think Smith-Njigba is going to get most of his reps in the slot as he did at Ohio State. That is where he has his bread and butter. He's able to do the most damage. And then behind those three guys, the big wild card here is D. Eskridge, because we still don't know what he is capable of doing because he's just been banged up. He hasn't been able to stay healthy enough to really get in a rhythm on offense. We know the athleticism is there. We know the big playability is there. But now I think that he's definitely at best wide receiver number 4 with investing a first-round pick in Smith-Njigba. And then away from him, Tariq Young would be the other player that I'm keeping a close eye on that might be able to get more snaps on offense. But certainly getting Smith-Njigba impacts both Young and Eskridge and their ability to be able to get on the field offensively for this football team.
Yeah, and I think that the two undrafted free agents, C.J. Johnson and Matt Landers, I think are definitely interesting as well. Cody Thompson, we're listing him here as kind of the primary backup behind Tyler Lockett at that flanker position, or the Z position. I think that what you have with Cody Thompson. I mean, he is a reliable route runner. He catches the ball well, but he is not the dynamic athlete. I'm really intrigued. You mentioned Tariq Young. You mentioned D. Eskridge. to me, they have the untapped athletic ability to pop. But again, you can't rely on that upside when you have questions about D. Eskridge, and obviously it's been as much of a disappointment as you can be at this point, considering where he was selected and just the fact that he is as gifted as he is. I mean, there is talent there to exploit. And then with Derek Young, I mean, you're intrigued, but still, you can't put all your eggs in a basket of a guy who's coming in just a second season out of Lenore Ryan, and frankly was seeing as many snaps on special teams in a fullback as he was a wide receiver a year ago. So all of those are the justification, in my opinion, of why you take Jaxon Smith-Njigba. And again, that was a little bit counter than what I had in my final mock draft. But as you mentioned before, Corbin, I really liked the fit early on. And I think that, again, as critical it was that Seattle address their deficiencies along the line of scrimmage, especially in run defense. It was just as critical. We've been talking about this for years now, that Seattle had to get a third weapon in the passing game. I think that Jaxon Smith-Njigba is going to prove the best of this year's rookie class in doing that. And that's why I think that Seattle's offense is going to continue to fly next season. And that might be the best reason for optimism of why Seattle could be making yet another return to the playoffs.
Before we transition to talking undrafted defensive free agent reported signings, one other name I want to make sure that we mention here, because Cade Johnson came on strong late last year. And I know with the addition of Jaxon Smith-Njigba, the chance of Johnson getting many reps in the slot right now seems slim. At the same time, you could see some chemistry developing between him and Geno Smith, and he can also play special teams. So that would be a name it'd be remiss not to mention, is maybe sticking around as your fifth receiver, and he's a guy that Geno Smith has shown confidence in. And maybe if Jaxon Smith-Njigba takes a little bit longer to get into the rhythm of things, maybe Cade Johnson ends up impressing enough in camp where he's able to get more snaps on offense than anticipated. So that is a name that I think we should at least keep an eye on, because he did make major strides last year and even made a couple catches late in the season to clinch a playoff berth against the Rams. All right, let's talk undrafted free agency here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Yesterday, we looked at offensive players. The Seahawks have 28 reported undrafted free agent signings, and that may seem like a large number, but they only had 52 players in their roster going into the draft. So a lot of really young talent coming in with the chance to impress in the offseason program, see if they can join a pretty large group of undrafted free agents that have found success in Seattle. And yesterday, admittedly, Rob, we looked at the offensive players. There weren't a lot of players that jumped out as players we talked about in the pre-draft process. They were clearly on the undrafted side of things. But on the defensive side of the ball, you and I have 3 or 4 names here of players that we actually had draftable grades on that the Seahawks were able to get their hands on in the undrafted ranks.
Yeah, exactly. And similar to yesterday, Corbin, when we were talking about the undrafted free agent prospects on the offensive side of the ball. Of course, we haven't had a chance to do the true film evaluations of all these prospects the way that we have a first and second and third round picks. Of course, I'm really excited in about a week and a half to get an opportunity to see these undrafted free agents in person. But at the same time, again, like yesterday, I focused in on one of the positions that I thought that Seattle got a kind of extraordinary talent in the undrafted free agent class at the wide receiver position. I was really intrigued by the different body types, the different athleticism of those players. Well, this time on defense, I'm going to focus in on the front seven. They've got a couple of defensive tackles that we're excited about. One guy that you can see here pictured, those of you watching on YouTube, and Jonah Tavai. Corbin, I know that you are excited about him, so I'm going to leave him to you. I'm going to start off with actually the player listed right below him, Robert Cooper from Florida State. You cannot get much more different than Jonah Tavai than Robert Cooper. 6'2", 335 pounds. I mean, he is that kind of big run-stuffing nose guard. This is a player that started an awful lot of games at Florida State and showed incredible toughness this past year, playing through a knee injury that would have sat most people down. And to me, those are some of the things that Seattle has always prioritized: that type of grit, that kind of toughness, that kind of team focus. So Robert Cooper is definitely a player that I think that that the Seahawks fans should be kind of paying attention to here in this class. A couple of linebackers as well. One, Cam Bright from UW, previously at Pitt, had an unbelievable workout at his pro day. Speaking of great workouts, Patrick McConnell from Montana, if he had been invited to the combine, his workout would have been right there with Jack Campbell and Nolan Smith and and some of the other guys that were absolutely spectacular in Indianapolis. But he showed true NFL caliber athleticism as well as the production to back it up at Montana. So again, to me, the front seven talent is where I'm most excited about Seattle's undrafted free agents on the defensive side of the ball.
As you mentioned, I have to gush a little bit about Jonah Tavai because he was a player that, you look at the size and you look at the measurables and everything screams that guy is not an NFL player. And he has sub 30-inch arms, which is usually a huge red flag when we're talking about defensive linemen, particularly interior defensive linemen. He's got short, sawed-off arms. He ran a 5.06 40-yard dash, so he's not an elite athlete, not even a good athlete for the position. And yet you turn on the film of this guy, and you immediately fall in love with the way that he plays the game, and he's incredibly productive. High motor. He's one of those guys, play in, play out, goes hard to the whistle. He's very technically sound, too. He compensates for that lack of length with having really quick, active hands, and he places them well. And so players like that, they can offset those deficiencies some. And you want to look at the production, 19 sacks and 28 tackles for loss the last 2 years at San Diego State. So he might have short arms. He might not be a great athlete, but he's a darn good football player. And of all the undrafted free agents the Seahawks reportedly have been linked to, he is the one that I actually right now I'm already making my prediction. He is the one I think has the best chance to make this football team because they don't have depth at defensive tackle. He's about 290 pounds. He's 5'10". He's short and stocky. But I actually think with his quickness off the ball, he's not fast, but he's quick. His penetrating ability and his really active hands, I actually think he could be a wild card to watch in that defensive line, and obviously incredibly productive at San Diego State. He's played some pretty good football teams too. It's not like they've been playing all FCS or Division II schools. They've played good Mountain West competition, a number of guys that got drafted this past week. And so Tavai is the player that jumps out to me as number one on this list that I'm most intrigued by, just with the production we saw from him in college. The other player I want to mention, Arquan Bush from Cincinnati. And yes, I love Cincinnati players. It's another one of those defenses. They've been coached up so well. We've seen how many guys have come into the league as high draft picks. Even Kobe Bryant is a fourth rounder playing a lot of snaps for the Seahawks. And Bush is around 5'11", 175, 180 pounds. Not a big guy. He's going to play in the boundary, not necessarily quick enough to play in the slot, but he plays physical football, and he had 7 interceptions the last 3 years. So he's got plus ball skills to go with that. He's not going to be making Seattle's roster as a cornerback necessarily, but I could see him being a player that impresses on special teams and maybe being a Joey Blunt type player this year that can sneak his way onto the roster.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I'm happy that you mentioned Joey Blunt, because there is one other player that I kind of have to mention just in passing. That would be Christian Young, the safety from Arizona.
Yep.
Now, he has a completely different size and skill set from Joey Blunt. But still, again, Christian Young is one of my favorite of the undrafted free agents that Seattle signed. But again, I wanted to kind of focus in on the front seven. That, to me, is where Seattle has the biggest areas of concern. That's where I think that it's most likely that if Seattle, if Seattle is going to be able to continue their magic when it comes to undrafted free agents, then on the defensive side of the ball, I do think it's going to be one of these front seven defenders rather than another defensive back.
And the other thing that's interesting about Young coming from Arizona, he is one of those modern safeties that has played linebacker at the college level. He really personifies that money linebacker position that a lot of NFL teams are employing now. Not the most athletic guy, but he moves well for a player that can play in the box, has actually got some experience playing as a single high safety in the past as well. He'll surprise you. He plays faster than his athletic testing, another one of those type of players. And so he's a long shot, especially with the fact the Seahawks used a draft pick on Jarek Reed II. That is a very deep position group. But the fact that he can play linebacker, he's played special teams, another name to keep a very close eye on as the offseason program goes through OTAs, mandatory minicamp, and eventually to training camp in late July. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks. We are on YouTube and other major podcast platforms. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single show. Coming up on our Thursday episode, Dallas Cooper and Nick Lee are going to be joining forces, and the two of them are going to be breaking down second-round selection Derek Hall, what he brings to Seattle's defense, and much more. Hope you'll be listening in. Thanks for tuning into our Wednesday episode. Go Hawks.